Most business podcasts aren't profitable, which is ironic because isn't that the whole purpose behind a podcast when you have a company is to make it something that's profitable for the bottom line of the organization? And it seems like most leaders approach this from the standpoint of, well, I'm raising my brand visibility, or I'm showcasing the subject matter expertise of my leaders, or something that's just like, hey, I don't really know why we're doing a podcast. We just need to have one because we need to see what happens. And all of those can be valid reasons to have a podcast. But I'm telling you today, if you could make your business podcast profitable, wouldn't you be interested in that? Well, I'm going to share with you today how to do that, how to turn your podcast into a profit center. And it doesn't have anything to do with advertising. My name is Ben Fanning. I am host of the Lead the Team podcast, where we're in the top 2% of all podcasts globally, and we help companies launch, strategize, and produce profitable business podcasts. And so for you today, we're going to talk about these three little ways, these three little steps that you can take with your podcast to turn it into a profit center. And the good news is if you've already got a podcast going, you can use at least 1, 2, or even 3 of these modifications to make it profitable. Or if you're just in the beginning phase, you can take this to actually help craft your podcast strategy. And by the end of this video, I'm going to share with you a way. If you want to have a direct conversation with me, I'll show you where you can schedule that. And we'll take it into a different realm where I explain to you our 5 steps to a profitable podcast, as well as what you can expect specifically for you, your company, in your industry as far as results. So let's dive in here. Sharing my slides. And as promised, how to turn your podcast into a profit center. And before we get going, we don't just talk about theory here, and I'm not going to just share just theory. This is the stuff that we're using for our own top 2% podcast called Lead the Team. You can scan this QR code. You can go check it out, subscribe if you want, and see what we're doing. At the time of this video, we're on episode 175, but we've also been working with lots of other companies on launching their podcasts. And if you look back in the previous videos, you'll see some of those and you'll get a flavor. But I just like to share that this is what we're actually doing, not just stuff that we're just talking about in theory. So step 1 is very simple, is to become a strategic host. Now, notice I'm not saying become a strategic subject matter expert. I'm not talking about doing a solo show where it's just you talking about your ideas. Now, we do that sometimes. And matter of fact, my very first podcast way back when, it was all about what I was producing and my ideas. And it did okay as a podcast. But profitable, I would say not. The way that you do this is you become a podcast host. Okay. And you're hosting the proverbial podcast party. That's right. You're inviting your suppliers, key employees, people you want to network with and build that relationship with, potential clients. All of these people are the people you want to invite to your show, and you want to showcase them. And so being a strategic host is different than being a strategic storyteller or strategic leader. You're trying to bring out of your guests their very best. And that's what we do on Lead the Team. And that's how the kind of shows that we create. And this creates the profitable opportunities to help one another, to help them, and also to help you grow and build your business, whether you've got 3 employees or whether you've got 100,000 employees or somewhere in between. You can leverage this simple strategy. And this is something that we work with companies on, because how you position this is really, really important. And so that's the first piece. The second one is to create a profitable recipe. And this is a metaphor that I use a lot. When I started my podcast, I thought it was a lot like stovetop cooking, where you could kind of start, and then on the stovetop, you can taste the food as you go along. You can adjust the seasoning. You can make it a little more done. keep cooking it a little bit and be flexible as you go along. And it's more, when I thought it was more about the art of improvisation. And in fact, if you've been listening to podcasts a while, some of your favorites, you might think, well, they're just improvising their conversation. But the reality is, that's not the reality. The reality is it's a lot more like baking a cake. And that's why I have these steps about a recipe. If you have a great baking recipe, you spend your time up front. Okay. You spend your time up front with the recipe, getting it just right. Maybe it's, for me, it's not as much about cake. It's about cornbread. I grew up in Alabama and we live in Charleston now. And I love some great cornbread recipes. And I've got one that's called Grandma's Cornbread Recipe that I've been doing for years. And this thing is tried and true. And just like with podcasting, over these last several years for us, we've been dialing in the recipe. And so we spend our time up front with you strategizing, as I hope you would, building out the recipe so every episode comes out really, really well. It's hard to go back after the podcast is done and then make magic out of it. It's way better to get a consistent, wonderful end result by having a strategic launch, a podcast through this checklist. And on the screen here, I'm sharing a little bit of our recipe with setup and per episodes and all the stuff that we do before and after and during to make it come out right each and every time. And so for you, when you as a leader are discussing this, it's not about improv. It's not about stovetop cooking and making adjustments and making a perfect edit. It's about having great episodes. In fact, if you spend your time up front, you will usually have very little to do afterwards from an editing standpoint. And you will come out and you'll also position this to move the relationship forward. Think about a recipe that's so good that produces the cake and the cornbread so well, AKA your episode. The people on the show, they want to share it. They want to share it with their employees, their suppliers, their customers. This is the power of growing a wonderful, powerful, positive, profitable podcast. Last one, step 3 is to develop a deliberate follow-up process. So spending your time up front, getting it right, produces great content. But great content is only half the battle. The other half is having a follow-up process to share the message, to get the right people to follow up, to share it, and then also to advance the business possibilities, the introductions, the relationships between your company and the company that was hosted on the show. There are a lot of different levels where this could work with a business podcast. Now, this is not the strategy for a Star Trek hobby podcast, but for a business podcast, this is a wonderful way to do it. So wrap it up here. Kickstart the conversation inside your organization. If you have a podcast that's not profitable today, which the odds are it's probably not, or if you're thinking about it, scan this QR code or click on the link below this video where I will post a link that will take you to my calendar. It'll allow you to schedule a 15-minute conversation with me, or in just a minute or two, I'll walk you through our 5-step process to a profitable podcast. So you'll understand that and walk away with that, as well as I will talk to you about what you can expect from a podcast. What kind of potential revenue streams, profitability, business results, strategic objectives that you're seeking to hit, and how a podcast fits into that. Because that's going to also allow you to understand how many resources you need to invest, what kind of planning that you need to have for the future. And these are all the things that you'll walk away in this quick consultation. And if you're not ready for that, no problem. Just stick around for the next episode. And I look forward to sharing that video with you soon.